I really want to lean into kind of the messiness of the situation I'm in while also showing some semblance of growth, right? You don't want to just say like everything's all doom and gloom, everything's messy and I haven't figured everything out. But thinking about what is something that you've been in the midst of and how are you moving forward through it? And what could others learn from that process, as opposed to thinking you have to be on the other side of it for your story to have worth. And I have found that lots of publications are really interested in narratives from kind of that messy middle where resilience happens, but setbacks do too. And thinking about that coexistence of both is important. So I try to lean into that because I think it really allows for a lot of authentic storytelling. Because I think that sometimes we end up trying to pitch pieces that are too polished, right? Where everything seems too neat and tidy. And ultimately, those pieces really aren't as relatable. So I think the restorative narrative framework can be really helpful for thinking about where is growth happening, even in the midst of an ongoing struggle.
This is Unknown to Known, an on-cam ready presentation. I'm Jamie Maglietta. Thanks so much for being here. If you're already enjoying this series, be sure to follow us on your podcast platform of choice or subscribe to our YouTube channel. I always say relevancy earns media, and today's guest is proof that bylines build books. Mallory Tenori Tarpley, welcome to Unknown to Known.
Thank you so much for having me, Jamie. It's great to be here.
I'm really glad you could join us. Just for some backstory, we met at Mom 2.0. So if you have a child or you're blogging about kids, like check out Mom 2. There was a lot of great connections built there. Mallory, how many times have you been to Mom 2? Was that your first time?
That was actually my first time, yes, but I have to go back.
Yeah, it was fun. We had this circle where we talked about pitching to the press. And Mallory, you started your career at Point. Like, not many people know this, what Poynter Institute is, but it's one of those essentials for journalists. And I think that that really says a lot about your credentials. So you worked your way up to managing editor. So cool, by the way, because I used to read it all the time when I worked on reliable sources. And you were teaching working journalists how to tell better stories. So, how did that foundation shape where you are now as a storyteller?
It was really foundational for me because when I graduated college, I had the choice of working at two newspapers in New England or moving to St. Petersburg, Florida from Massachusetts to work at the Poynter Institute. And certainly I was drawn to the idea of living in Florida as a 20 something, but I also really wanted to be able to work at a place like Poynter because it is a professional school for journalists. And I thought it would be a place where I could really grow and thrive. And so it turns out that that was the reality. I went and I started off as a copy editor and then worked my way up to a staff writer and then eventually managing editor. And along the way, I was really covering the media industry. So I was a journalist writing about journalism and covering trends in the industry, and then also teaching journalists how to use social media as a reporting and writing tool. And this was in 2007, 2008, when social media was still in its nascency. So there was some pushback at the time from some journalists who said, well,
Yes.
we don't think that social media is going anywhere, or we don't think it's a reliable tool. But it was really interesting to be on the front lines of saying, well, it does have potential and we need to figure out how do we use it in an ethical way as journalists. So being there was so helpful because it exposed me to so many different journalists. As a journalist who was covering the media, I was
Mhm.
on the phone every day with journalists from around the country. And so, in terms of networking, it really helped me to just get to know so many more journalists, but also to understand the inner workings of how stories are told and reported in journalism.
Mhm. And that's such great insight. Insight I wish I could have had when I was producing reliable sources. You know, with the newsletter and the podcast, it was a lot of fun working with Brian and the team, but I never really had the print background in journalism other than a few, when I started out in local. So you've been, very blessed to have that, which I think really will help this conversation. Everyone who's listening, I talk about this often. You really want to be thinking like a journalist if you're an expert within your niche. And in this conversation, we are going to give you some tips that you can use today. From Poynter, you went and built your byline list. That it's a list most writers really only dream of. I mean, we're talking New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Time, the Washington Post, Teen Vogue, the list goes on. At what point did you realize that those bylines were building something bigger for you?
Really felt like I wanted to continue writing once I left Pointer, because when I left Pointer, I was starting to work in leadership roles at media adjacent organizations. So, other organizations that were aimed at helping journalists to be better at what they did. And I thought, well, I don't want to lose sight of my writing. I want to keep up with my writing, because if I'm teaching other people how to be better journalists, I need to be immersed in the craft myself still. And I believe that still today as a journalism professor. I want to be in touch and relevant. So the freelance writing has really enabled me to keep up with journalistic skills, and it has helped me to build my audience, because there have been so many different publications that I've pitched throughout the years. And I have found that with every piece, I end up hearing from readers who then are drawn to other aspects of my work, like my book, like my teachings, like my newsletter. And so it tends to have this ripple effect where I publish a piece, I hear from readers, and then my kind of scope of audience expands. And so I think that there's real value in that. And also, writing too helps me to really understand what it is that I'm saying. There's a great Joan Didion quote, and she at one point said, I write to figure out what I'm thinking, right? It's something along those lines. And so when I write, it helps me to crystallize my ideas. And sometimes the articles that I'm publishing in these various media outlets end up being stepping stones toward a bigger project. So there's so much value I have found in trying to freelance and keeping up with that, and also trying to get my pieces in a wide variety of different outlets so that I'm not just freelancing for the same ones.
Yeah, and I would say as a freelance, I freelance as an editor and I'm still trying to get my own articles in the hands of, papers and magazines online. It's not easy. And for those listening, we're going to make sure we give you some tips because I'm sure you're also feeling the same way. It's not always easy to be seen, to stand out. There's ways you can do that. We'll both give you some tips. She mentioned her book. There's her book over her shoulder if you guys are watching on YouTube. Tell us about that book before we keep going.
Sure. So this is my debut memoir. It was published by Simon Schuster last August. It's titled Slip, and it is a reported memoir that really looks at my experiences of losing my mom as a child and then developing anorexia. And it explores what I call the middle place, which is this name I've given to this gray in-between space, in between acute sickness and full recovery. And that's where I've lived out most of my life as a woman in eating disorder recovery. And it's not really something that's talked about much in eating disorder literature. And so when I worked on the book, I surveyed over 700 people with lived experience with eating disorders of all kinds, and then interviewed about 175 survey respondents, clinicians, and researchers, and wove all of that together with my own story. So really was a journalistic undertaking and this true labor of love that I had dreamed of ever since I was a child, really. Even when I was in the very early stages of my eating disorder at age 12, I thought one day I'm going to write about this. And so it has felt really surreal to just have it out in the world. And the Spanish version was also just published, which is what you see next to Slip there.
Oh, I was wondering, I couldn't really tell.
Yes.
And I wanna get to the story behind when this got solidified as your opportunity with Simon& and Schuster, but I had a producer moment. You said 700 people?
Yes.
My goodness, that's 700 reels of
Yeah.
stories and testimonials that you could be sharing in a little tiny tidbit of information if they're allowed to be shared. And that could be a great way to connect with your audience because building within your niche is going to really also help. I tell people like your social media following isn't going to guarantee you book sales. But as your engagement grows, it makes you more well known within that niche. And it's also another trickle down effect. So, have you found that from social media you are converting people to book buyers?
I do think that I am. It's hard to see the direct correlation because even though I get weekly sales numbers, I'm not able to see exactly where those sales come from. So
Yeah.
sometimes it feels a bit enigmatic, but yes, I do find that oftentimes I will post something on social media that is content adjacent to the book, and folks will start following me. They'll reach out to me to say that really resonated with me, or I'm going to pick up your book now. So, anecdotally, I definitely see that connection. And my social media numbers have certainly grown in the past 11 months since the book came out. So, I do get a sense that folks are seeing the content that I'm posting and then wanting to buy the book. And I will just say too that my approach has evolved a little bit over the past year. Whereas initially I was posting a lot of purely promotional posts saying, buy my book, or
Yeah,
my
get
book
it.
is on sale, right? Or here are all the pictures from my latest book event. But I realized that people can only take so much of that. And I was feeling like it was getting a little too promotional in a way. And
Mm,
so I thought, well, what if I could create some really interesting carousels on Instagram, for instance, that are providing insights and tips for folks with eating disorders or people dealing with loss and grief. So, thinking about some of the main themes in my book and how I can create content that people can use and that they'll find meaningful. And I find that that's what really resonates with people. Those
mhm.
are the posts that get shared, those are the posts that lead to messages. And so, I have been trying to do more of those as a way of really engaging people and ultimately hoping that they buy the book as a result.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's a good strategy. So Simon and Schuster, how did this happen? Because so many people ask, how do I land a trad pub for my book launch? And tell them the story because when I heard it, I was like, wow, this speaks to everything I tell people.
Yes, yes. I know it is very hard to get a book deal with a commercial publisher for memoir, especially because
Mhm.
with memoir, so often folks want there to be authors with big platforms, or they want it to not just be a memoir, but a memoir plus something else, which I'll get into in a minute. But initially, I was fortunately able to land an agent relatively easily because, in order to get a book deal with a big five commercial publisher, you need to have an agent. And so I was in grad school getting my master's in fine arts in creative nonfiction and was working on my book as part of that. And fortuitously, I had published a piece in the New York Times at 11 a.m. And that coincided with the exact same time that I was jumping on a call with a group of literary agents. My master's program had put together this call. And so we had the opportunity to pitch agents on our project. So I was able to pitch the agent and then say, oh, by the way, I just had a piece published in the New York Times about this topic. So certainly that piqued her interest. And I ended up having a follow up conversation with her and signing on with her shortly after. So in that case, the New York Times article was hugely helpful because I was really able to play that up and show the direct connection between my book and the audience that I was building in these other spaces. And so ended up working on a proposal with my agent, and I thought, well, if I have an agent, I'll get a book deal, no problem. But that didn't turn out to be the case. My agent is lovely and wonderful and has so many connections. But we found that when we started sending out my proposal to various editors, we were getting lots of rejections and ended up getting 18 rejections. And I was just so heartbroken and felt so dejected because, especially with memoir, it's so personal. And so you're putting so much into the book idea, so much into the proposal. My proposal was 85 pages, right? So no small feat to get that finished. And I just felt like, oh, what am I going to do? And I knew I wanted this to one day be a book. So I decided to go back to the drawing board and say, what can I do differently? And around this time, this new genre was emerging called Memoir Plus. And the idea is that you take your memoir and you add something else to it. So that could be reporting, it could be investigation, it could be social commentary, research. And more commercial publishers are wanting to see that from memoirists so that it's not just a straight narrative, but it's a narrative plus something else that will broaden people's scope of understanding. So I thought, well, I'm a journalist by trade. My plus could be reporting. And so that prompted me to launch the survey that I mentioned. It prompted me to start interviewing people. And so I did all of that work for about a year. I reworked the proposal, and then we sent out the proposal again and framed this really as a narrative narrative nonfiction book that would blend personal narrative with reporting and research, and proceeded to get more rejections. I ended up getting about 35 rejections in total. But the old adage in publishing is that it only takes one yes to get a book deal. And that ended up proving true. I ended up getting a book deal from a Simon and Schuster imprint. And I really think that it was that plus, that additional reporting that I was doing that helped. And in that year, in between those two proposals, I was also writing more. So I was also publishing. So I could say in that proposal that I had been continuing to build my audience in the spaces that aligned with the book that I was writing. So all of that combined really led to a book deal. But it took a whole lot of perseverance and a whole lot of work even after I got the book deal, because then I had to restructure the book and rethink it and really sort of almost rewrite it in a way, because when you write a proposal for memoir, you include a couple sample chapters, but you're not expected to write the full manuscript. So the really hard work comes after you get that book deal.
So many people think that they have to have high engagement numbers on social media and big follower counts. I know you don't have huge follower counts. So in this case, would you say that your journalistic pursuits, your becoming known within your niche on a journalistic level, helped you over your social media numbers?
Very much so. I think it helped tremendously, because I will say that probably 8 or 9 years before I ended up getting an actual book deal, I had been introduced to another agent. And I remember sending her some of my clips, because at that point I had been published in the Washington Post and some other publications. But the agent wrote back pretty promptly and said, "Oh, she said, I love your book idea, but in order to get a book deal for a memoir, you would need a lot more social media followers." And at the time, I had about 7,000 followers on Twitter and other followers on different platforms. And she said, "Oh, no," she said, "you need like hundreds of thousands of followers." And I just thought to myself, wow, I mean, essentially, she's telling me that I need to be famous or have this ginormous platform in order for my book to be valid. And I think that in the years since, there has been a greater understanding that there can be really well written memoirs from folks who don't have huge social media platforms, but who are engaging audiences in other ways, right? Be it on social media, on Substack. And so I found that I did not have that big platform on social media, but I did have all of the clips, all of those freelance stories from news organizations. I had credibility as a professor. I had in my proposal a very detailed plan about who I would market the book to and how I, as the author, would do a lot of that legwork of publicizing it, because publishers want to know that authors aren't going to just be relying solely on in-house publicists to do all the work. They get excited when they see that an author is wanting to do that work themselves. With the help of in-house publicists and marketers. So all of that combined really helped. And even still, I don't have a big social media platform. It has steadily grown as I've built my own strategy around audience building and the growth of the book. But I will say, I don't think that it is a prerequisite to have a massive social media following to get a book deal. And sometimes I've seen folks who will pay people, right? They'll sort of pay for subscribers and do everything that they can and put so much energy into trying to build up their subscriber base. And I think to myself, that's important to an extent, but also it's a lot of extra time that you could be spending on the actual creative process and on getting better at writing, right?
At the same time, if you're paying for someone to help you boost those subscribers or those followers aren't going to turn into people who are buying. So
Exactly.
it's inflated, and that's unfortunate too. And then a traditional publication is going to be investing in someone that they think is going to turn over a ton of books and can't. But Twitter over 7,000 at the time to me would have been like, okay, look, she's skin in the game here. And a lot of people I speak with don't realize how important Twitter is. And I say to them, if you want to attract the media, you need to be there as a niche expert, as someone who has, lived experience that you want to share, that you want publicity for. It's a great platform. On one of my other episodes, I spoke with a woman who showed up on Instagram sharing just about her son and how she and her son are estranged. She started to build up a following, and that led to she wound up being interviewed by the Wall Street Journal. She was in USA Today, and then they made her the cover of USA Today on Mother's Day, and she landed on Oprah. And I'm like, if you put the effort in on social, you can see it pay off for some people. But the dedication there, to your point, takes away from writing the book. It can take away from putting yourself out there in another way, because we can't be spread too thin, right? It's
Yeah.
hard. But I always tell people, that body of work that you put out there online tells a producer, an editor, before you even meet, if your byline, if your social media, if there's engagement, it shows like if you're ready for national TV, depending on how you show up. And that is also an audition, right? And that audition was also for Simon and Schuster. They're probably looking at your whole picture before they say yes.
Yes.
And that's important. It's a strategy. All right, let's get tactical for the audience. Someone listening right now, they may think, I have the expertise, right? I've been writing this book for 10 years. I have a story to tell, and I need it published, and I want it published by a major outlet. Where do you think they should start?
Yeah, so I think it's really important to, one, be an active consumer of media. And that may seem very rudimentary, but I think sometimes people want to pitch news outlets, but then they don't actually consume news and media. And so
Mhm.
then there ends up being a disconnect because they don't know where to pitch. They don't know the voice of the different publications or what journalistic pieces actually sound like, because writing a piece for a news outlet is very different from, say, writing a book or writing an essay from
Or a
college,
Substack.
right?
Mhm.
Yes, exactly. So it requires a different kind of writing. So I think the more you are consuming news media, the better, because it gets you just more familiar with that particular style. But I think it's really helpful to just look and see kind of different publications that you admire and that you like, and go to their about page and see if they actually are accepting submissions, because there are lots of websites that will say we select or we solicit freelance work, and if you want to pitch us, here's what makes for a good pitch, right? So if you look at Business Insider's website, for instance, they have that. When I pitched Teen Vogue on a piece, they had a really detailed page saying here's who to pitch depending on the topic. Same thing with Newsweek, for instance. So there's all these different publications that have that information available, and you just have to find it on the homepage. It's usually somewhere in the About section. And so I always think that that's a helpful starting point, particularly if you don't have connections in media. There have been times where I've pitched news outlets based on connections that I have as a longtime journalist, and certainly that always helps. But if you don't have those connections, pitching to a particular editor based on what you see in those kind of submission pages is really helpful. And that typically is going to get you farther than if you just send it to some generic email that you have found on a particular website.
And also having that pitch, fully formed, even to the point where you know what your headline might be. And it's the same with TV. Like if you're listening right now and you're thinking, "Wait, what do you mean by headline?" What do you If you're looking at an article, the top line, that's your headline, and then you'll have like a smaller print under it, that's the subheadline. And you really want to think about what that would say on the article. Same for television. If you're pitching TV, you want to think, well, what are the 50 characters I could see at the bottom of the screen if I were to be booked on this topic? Because they need to know what that could be, because that's going to help sell your idea and your story. So you really want to think through to that extent. You're teaching. So as a professor, tell us more about where you teach, your students, what are the mistakes you kind of see them making, and do they want traditional media when they're getting out of school, or are they looking more at YouTube and Substack? Give us some insight.
Yeah, so I teach journalism at the University of Texas at Austin, and I teach undergraduates and graduate students. And a lot of my students do want to go into journalism, but Not all of them do. I would say that probably half of them do if I were to put a number to it. And the other half end up often going into communications related fields. So they may do marketing, they might do social media, they may end up helping with PR for a nonprofit. So lots of different transferable skills. And I think that that's one of the values of a journalism degree is that you learn so much that could be applied to other professions. But a lot of my students do want to try to find jobs in journalism. And so I tend to teach them really practical skills. And I teach them about freelancing, which is not something that is often taught in journalism schools. But I think it's so important, particularly for students who may not be able to find a job in journalism right out of college, but who want to stay in the profession. And I think all too often we're sort of letting students graduate and then they're finding that first job in another profession. And it becomes harder for them to then say, well, my next job will be in journalism because they're already carving out a profession in a different field. Whereas if they understand how to pitch stories, how to freelance, then they can keep up with their journalism and it keeps it more top of mind and it makes them more marketable if they do want to apply for a journalism job, say a year into that first job out of college. So I talk with my students a lot about pitching and teach professional journalists about this too. And one thing I notice is that sometimes students will start off a pitch by saying, oh, well, my name is so and so. And I think, oh, that is a very dull beginning because usually the editors can see your name, one in the signature line, but also just in the top of the email when they kind of see who it's from. And so I always say start with a hook, right? Start with something really compelling from the essay or the article that you want to pitch so that you're almost sort of framing that pitch as a narrative of sorts. And
Mhm.
you want to use the pitch as a way to show off your storytelling skills. So you start off with a kind of narrative driven pitch, and then you move into more of the specifics of, okay, this would be a piece that would be, about 1,000 words. And here's some of the reporting I'm going to do for it. Here's a little bit more about me, right? I usually put the info about me farther down so that I'm really centering the actual narrative. And to your point, I always tell students and professionals, put the headline in the pitch, right? Because I've had editors who have written back to my pitches and said, well, can you come up with a headline? Because headlines really make or break our pieces. And being able to craft a headline shows the editor that you're serious about it. So I think the pitch is such an art, and I'm happy to talk more about it. But I will just say, too, that one thing that I always try to convey is that it's really important to know the publication that you're pitching to. So
Yeah.
sometimes I have folks who want to publish in HuffPost Personal, for instance, or Newsweek or other publications, and they'll say, well, I have a piece that's 3,500 words, and I pitched it to them, and they said no. And I said, well, that's because they don't accept pieces that are 3,500 words, right? And so you need to know the publication, even if you have to copy and paste an article into Word to see what the word count is. You have to know, right? What is the typical word count? And usually for most media outlets these days, I mean, you're looking at around 1,000 words. I've had pieces that are typically between 750 and 1,500 words for a news outlet, and then sometimes between 2,000 and 3,000 words for a magazine. But once you start talking about 3,500, 4,000 words, that's usually going to get a no because it's just too big. So know who you're pitching, know kind of what their stories are like, and also how long their stories tend to be.
Yeah, and I would add, when you're putting together that pitch and she's saying, and you correct me if you would disagree, but I always tell people when you're putting in at the bottom of your pitch and you're saying, this is more about me, you want to link everything you can because they will start poking around. I have this media readiness diagnostic I offer clients when they come through and I evaluate them, right? So if you were to pitch me now, where am I going first? Well, if you didn't put links in your pitch and I'm interested, I'm going to Google search you. So what's going to come up on a Google search? If I search you and it goes to this like I don't know. I don't want to call it, I don't want to make fun of a website, but some people's websites are just not really up to date and they look old and they're just not appealing. They're not modern. And I'll get to it and be like, oh, okay, there's no relevancy, no updates as to what they're up to. I'll then say, okay, let me see. Have they been in the news? Have they been quoted? Google them, see that there's nothing on them. There are no articles about them. Okay, at some point, that's usually when I stopped searching as a producer when I was producing shows. If there was still a little bit of interest in me and I'm like, "Oh, but I really wanna find this person because this could be a really good guest," I'll then look at LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. If by the time I get to YouTube, I don't find any interviews of that person, any references, I'm kind of at a dead end. I can't really book them on TV without that national exposure or an interview to say, "Hey guys, this person has I found it. She has an interview on YouTube. She could be good on camera. This is her background." So, you don't want people, producers, to be searching like that if you're compelling. You wanna make sure all that's in that pitch, especially if you're going to television producers. I know, with print, it's a little bit different, but I'd love to hear your take on that.
Yeah, I think that that's incredibly important. And I think that linking also enables you to keep that kind of biographical information relatively short, right? Because we're not asking you to put a whole CV into the pitch. But if you have just a really nice, meaty paragraph that explains who you are and where you've been published or where you've appeared on TV, that really helps to show your credibility. And so I always do that, where I'll say, my work has been published in these various outlets. You can see more of my writing samples here. And so I link to my website and I make sure I keep the writing page on my website always up to date with my latest clips. And so similarly, when I have pitched different broadcast TV stations, I will say, I have appeared on these different podcasts or I've done TV interviews for these other outlets and networks. And that helps because it shows, okay, I've got that experience. Now, even if you don't have that experience, that is okay, right? I mean, there are going to be some folks who say, well, I've never actually been published in a media outlet. But in that case, if you are prolific on Instagram, for instance, you could link to your Instagram account because even captions are a form of writing in and of themselves. You can link to your Substack, right? So if you have a newsletter, linking to that. So getting a little bit creative and not thinking, well, I've never been published by a mainstream outlet, so I never will be, right? That's not the case. You just have to get creative in terms of thinking about where else are you producing content and how can you link to that to show editors that you're serious about content production.
Yeah, and when you start to build up that repertoire, having that media kit can also help. I've had people pitch where they're like, "I'm a legal correspondent. I've been on all these networks and I want to appear on yours. Here's my point of view on this legal story." Okay, this is great. They do everything we're saying, putting in their hook, their story idea, links, a little bio, and then they'll attach a media kit. And that media kit, when I open it and it looks super professional, I'm sold. I'm like, wow, this person's legit. They're ready. In a lot of cases, those media kits will link to a reel on Vimeo or YouTube, all the video clips of them on TV. So you want to start thinking big picture as you keep pitching and as you keep growing and building your media list of all the opportunities you've secured as an expert. But yeah, I would say like the media kit isn't as helpful unless you are like one of those people who, for a TV producer, one of those people who I'm like, could this person work? It's sometimes good to have that media kit as like, push me over the edge and get me to book you. But it is actually becoming one of those things that podcasters want. They want to see, what you have and they want to see it professionally put together. So it's interesting how the pitch, I think, is evolving. But to your point, as long as you are providing them with that strong narrative, a really good idea, and visuals in some cases to illustrate the points, that can really help.
It can. And sometimes too, I've included photos in my pitches, or I have said, I have some great photos to go along with this. And so anything you can do to just show that you're willing to put in that work can be really helpful because if you suggest a headline and you say you have photos, I mean, that is all kind of moving you closer to an actual yes from a publication. And I would say too that, again, you don't have to necessarily attach the piece, right, in the pitch. Sometimes I get that question of, do I have to have the whole piece written before I pitch? And it really depends upon the news organization. So I have found that most of the time I'm able to just pitch and then I get the green light and then I move forward. But other times there are news outlets increasingly that are wanting to see pieces on spec, meaning that they will only accept a piece once they've actually read it in its entirety. So so in those cases, I have gone ahead and written the piece most of the time. Sometimes if I've got other things on my plate, I'll say, I just can't right now. But if they don't end up wanting it, then I always say, okay, I'm going to pitch it elsewhere. And there have been times where in the recent past, I have pitched essays to 8 or 9 different publications, and it's been the 10th one, for instance, that has said yes. And I say that as someone who has been a journalist for over 20 years. So just keep that in mind that you may get rejections or you may get radio silence. And so always follow up. I always allow time for follow up, and just recognizing that editors are busy. And
Hmm.
sometimes it's in those follow ups that I get a yes. But if I get a rejection, I then move on to another publication. And just know that oftentimes the rejections are very succinct, right? It'll usually be, oh, thanks for submitting. This isn't a great fit for us, but I hope it finds a home elsewhere.
Word
And
for word.
that, yes, exactly. That is really the extent of it. They're not going to be telling you what you could do better unless they're interested in it and they just want you to make some tweaks. But otherwise, don't press, right? Just sort of say, okay, I'm going to try to pitch it elsewhere. And if you get a lot of rejections, it may be an indication that you need to rewrite it or there's something off with it. Or it just may be that it's just not what they're looking for right now. So I think all of that is important to consider, as well as the timeliness of it. So if there are ways that you can think about how the piece that you're wanting to write relates to something that's happening in the here and now, that's always going to be appealing to news outlets. And so sometimes I will write pieces and I'll think, well, this is somewhat related to back to school. So I have this idea. I'm going to wait until July to pitch it, and I'll peg it as a really great back to school piece for September, right? And that has worked. Other times I have had to fudge it a little bit, where I wrote a piece, for instance, about self love. It was a piece about just how I find small victories in recovery and how I celebrate those. And there was a period where I was celebrating small victories by making these little origami hearts, and I would put them in a little jar and it would help me to see my
Yeah.
progress. And I thought, well, there's no timeliness to this. But then I thought, well, it's almost Valentine's Day and I'm talking about origami hearts and self love. So I pitched it to the LA Times saying this can make a really great Valentine's Day piece. And they ran it on Valentine's Day. So sometimes you get a little creative with what makes it timely, and you might surprise yourself.
I love that. And I remember you telling us that at Mom too. It was a great story. There's a concept you work with called restorative narrative. Am I correct in how I pronounce it? Stories that show people finding meaningful pathways forward after trauma. That's a really specific editorial lens. How has this lens really helped you shape your stories and shape, I'm assuming, some of your clients' stories as they're trying to come forward? How do you work with people on this, and how can people work with you?
Yeah, so I really believe in the power of these restorative narratives, which are really aimed at helping to show how people and communities are able to make meaningful progress forward in the aftermath of trauma and tragedy and illness. And so this is very much at the heart of my book, Slip, where I found that so many books on eating disorders were written from the perspective of people who were fully recovered and who were over their eating disorder. And for the longest time, I thought, well, I need to be fully recovered in order to get a book deal and in order for my book to have value. But I realized actually in writing that New York Times piece that I mentioned that there was value in writing from the perspective of someone who's in the messy middle of recovery and who has been for most of my adult life, because it was in that New York Times piece that I talked about the middle place of recovery. And that's very much rooted in this idea of restorative narrative. And I got so many comments from people who said, oh, thank you for naming this and thank you for writing about it. So I really take that restorative narrative approach whenever I'm pitching pieces, where I don't want to pitch essays, for instance, that have a tidy bow at the end where everything's wrapped up and perfect. I really want to lean into kind of the messiness of the situation I'm in, while also showing some semblance of growth, right? You don't want to just say like everything's all doom and gloom, everything's messy and I haven't figured everything out. But thinking about what is something that you've been in the midst of and how are you moving forward through it, and what could others learn from that process, as opposed to thinking you have to be on the other side of it for your story to have worth. And I have found that lots of publications are really interested in narratives from kind of that messy middle where resilience happens, but setbacks do too. And thinking about that coexistence of both is important. So I try to lean into that because I think it really allows for a lot of authentic storytelling. Because I think that sometimes we end up trying to pitch pieces that are too polished, right? Where everything seems too neat and tidy. And ultimately, those pieces really aren't as relatable. So I think the restorative narrative framework can be really helpful for thinking about where is growth happening, even in the midst of an ongoing struggle.
And I'm like holding back tears because you're speaking to me so much right now. Huh, I've been going through my own thing, not very similar, it's different. And I think the messy middle really truly is the part where you want to connect with people the most. It's going to help you get through. Just saying that from experience. And I'm trying to, do my own thing as everyone's listening. And if you follow me on TikTok, my very tiny, tiny TikTok audience, I just started sharing about my own healing journey there. And, it's hard to even put those TikToks together. You're like, oh gosh, do I really want to talk about this? But that messy middle is what my keynote just got written on. And I'm like so excited to finally have a keynote. And so as she's talking, if you feel like you resonate with that, there'll be links in the description. You can reach out to her, get some tips. And I also wanted to make sure we talked about slip and just, a little bit about it. But I was wondering, the whole reporting aspect of it. I believe I read that you got some funding or you had some support in that. So how did tell us about that because that's fascinating to me.
Yeah, so I had my advance money, and the advance is the money that you get once you sign a book deal. But I felt like it would be helpful to get additional funds. I mean, we always want more kind of funds to do our creative work. And so
Yeah.
I thought, well, I'm going to apply for different grants because there are lots of grants for aspiring authors and then grants for authors who already have book deals. And so I applied to a wide array of different grants and ended up not getting any of the smaller grants that I applied for, but I did get the biggest grant I applied for, which was from the Sloan Foundation.
Yeah.
And I applied for this grant from the Sloan Foundation, which does require grantees or applicants to have a book deal. So I had just signed the book deal. I had a year and a half to complete the book. And so I thought, okay, I want to be able to go on reporting trips. I want to be able to go places and interview folks face to face. And I want to buy lots of books as part of my research. And I thought, I could really use a grant to help with this. And so the Sloan Foundation is really invested in sort of supporting authors who are writing books rooted in science. And I thought, well, I'm not necessarily writing a science book, but there is a lot of really interesting research emerging about the neurobiology of eating disorders and the genetic aspects. So I thought, what if I were to report on that and use that as the basis for my application? And so I submitted the application thinking this is so sort of probably out of reach for me because it's science related. It's the biggest grant I'm applying for. But to my surprise, it's the one that I got. And it was so helpful, both in terms of just getting the additional support that I needed financially and also helping me to really lean into some of that science. Because without that grant, I don't know that I would have been motivated to do that. But I think it really helped the book to shine. And so I always encourage authors to apply for grants, big and small, and don't underestimate the time that you're spending as an author. So I made sure with each of those grant budgets that I had to create that I was budgeting for authors' time because that is important and that is something that foundations will offer up money for in addition to other budget line items.
That's so cool. And before we go, I just want to make sure that we also talk about your Substack. So, right at the edge, tell us a little bit about what they can expect if they go and find you on Substack.
Yes. So I would love for y'all to join my Substack. It's just Mallory, Mallary.substack.com. And yes, it's titled Right at the Edge because I really try to help writers to push past the edge of their discomfort and to stretch in new ways. And so I have weekly posts on there aimed at helping writers to be better at their craft. And I really try to make the posts applicable to writers at all stages, whether you're just beginning or you're a more seasoned professional. And so lots of tips on on pitching news outlets, tips on how to write memoir, tips on finding story ideas. So it's a great place to go. And I also have a paid feature too for folks who want a little bit more one-on-one coaching with me.
And that's so cool. I'm actually thinking about adding that to mine. I might as well. Everyone's doing it.
Yeah, yeah, it's a value
Have you
add.
enjoyed Substack?
I have. I love Substack. I mean, for one, it's a way for me to keep up with my writing. So, right when I finished my manuscript and turned it into Simon and Schuster, I started my Substack because I felt like I needed to keep writing. And so, it also feels like a way to give back to the community because while I was asking people to buy my book, I was also publishing posts on Substack saying, here are lessons learned. And so, it's been really valuable. And I've met so many other writers through the platform. So it feels like a very supportive space for writers.
It is. You know, it's slow growing on Substack for anyone who's just getting started, but it's a very engaging community. Mallory, I want to end the way I'm trying to end every episode. I used to do this where I give everybody 30 seconds. You know, if you had 30 seconds left on air and you could say anything that you really want to make sure you say, what would you say?
So that's a great question. I would say that it is so important to really believe in the story that you want to tell. I think along the way, you might have people who make you doubt whether your story is worthy of being told, or who may say, oh, that's never going to happen. But I will say that I started working on my book when I was 17 and wrote different iterations throughout the years and wasn't sure if it would ever see the light of day, but it did. And it just took that perseverance. So if you want to write a story, if you want to write a book, you need to actually believe in it and put in the time to do it, because so many people say they want to write a book, for instance, but then they never make time to do the writing. So make the time and believe in it, and you'll be surprised by what can happen.
That's such good advice. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, thanks for having me.
And guys, remember, there'll be links in the description, so check it out and be sure to find Mallory on Substack and check out the Amazon link to her book. All right, guys, I'll see you online.